The lonely cowboy rode in town, alone for supplies, but found a hungry bride begging for bread, and a second chance he'd never dared to want. Snow lay over Dry Creek like a thick quilt, soft on the roofs, heavy in the street, and mean in the alleys where the wind cut through. The day had the color of tin, the sky low and gray, and the town quiet except for a door hinge here, a wagon creak there, and the hiss of cold against skin. Sawyer Reed rode in alone, his horse steady under him, his coat stiff with frost. He had come for salt, for cartridges, for a bottle to warm a night, and maybe to hear a human voice that was not his own. He tied off outside the general store, but a warm smell slid into the cold and turned his head. Bread, fresh from an oven. The bakery sat 2 doors down, windows fogged, a yellow light inside. He took a step that way, then stopped. By the refuse barrel near the door, a woman knelt. She had no gloves, no hat worth the name, only a dress that might once have been fine, lace ruined, hem torn, and stained. Her fingers were raw and red, and she was digging gentle, as if the barrel might bite. She pulled out half a roll, crust ashy, and pressed it to her mouth like a prayer. The door flew open, hot air spilling across the porch. The baker's wife filled the frame, face set hard. "Get away from there," she snapped. "Go on, girl, off with you," begging like a dog. Her broom whistled through the air. The woman flinched, crumbs on her lips, eyes wide and hollow. Sawyer stepped between them without thinking, his body a wall against the wind and the broom both. He went inside. The heat smelled of flour, yeast, and life. "A fresh loaf," he said, voice low. The baker's wife grunted, snatched one from a shelf, and slapped it on the counter. He put coins down, did not look at her face, and walked back into the cold. He crouched in front of the woman, held out the bread. A lady should not have to beg for bread, he said. Her lashes were white with snow, and her lips were cracked. She looked from the loaf to his hand, unsure, like a stray that does not trust a kind voice yet. Then she took it, slow, careful, as if it might vanish. "Thank you," she whispered. "I did not mean to. She swallowed, then took a bite. A sound left her, small and full of relief and shame together. Behind them, the broom holder scoffed. "She is the runaway," she said for the street to hear. "From New Hope, stole jewels from her groom and ran. Threw away a fortune for foolish pride." The woman's mouth closed. She held the loaf tight. Sawyer studied her, the sharp bones in her cheeks, the set of her jaw. "Is it true?" he asked. "Not soft, but not hard either." "My name is Margot Lair," she said. "I was to wed Lucas Averill. I ran. That is all." "That is your business," he said, and stood. Snow blew between them, fine knives of ice. "You have somewhere warm tonight." She shook her head. "Behind the saloon, near the stables, if I keep quiet." He unwound his scarf, wool rough from years, and wrapped it around her shoulders. It smelled of smoke, horse, and pine. Her breath hitched. "I will be back before sundown," he said. "Do not go far." He mounted and rode into the gray, a shape fading into falling light. Margot sat in the snow, bread in her hands, scarf at her throat, and for the first time in weeks, the air in her chest did not hurt so much. She ate slow, each bite a blessing, and when the wind rose, she pulled the scarf close like it could keep the world out, and waited. Dusk came early that winter, the sky a dull pewter lid pressed low, the wind drawing long sad lines through the alleys behind the saloon, where the boards were warped and the barrels sweated cold. Margot tucked herself in the narrow space between the feed room and the broken fence, her back to the timber, her knees pulled up, the scarf he had given her wrapped twice around her neck. It smelled like smoke and horse, and it felt like a promise, small but steady. She kept the loaf close, ate the last crumbs slow, and listened to the town speak without looking at her, the way people do when they want to cut without seeing the blood. "I heard she stole an emerald brooch," someone said by the general store, voice bright with gossip. "Worth more than this whole town." Another voice followed, low and mean. "Runaway bride, bounty on her head, dead or alive. That is what I heard." The word slid down the alley and pooled at her feet, cold as the snow. Margot pressed her hands under her thighs to find what heat she could, and she breathed in and out until the sting behind her eyes dulled. She had learned how to make herself small, how to go still enough to pass for shadow. But the hunger in her belly and the ache in her bones would not be quiet. The stable hand came once, said nothing, only tilted a bucket so a few dry kernels spilled near her boots, and then he went back to his chores. That, too, was a kind of mercy. The wind shifted, sharper now, carrying the sweet yeast smell from the bakery and the sour reek from the saloon, and with it came footsteps, measured and even. Margot curled her fingers around a splintered slat she had hidden, her heart climbing high into her throat. The shape in the alley mouth was broad, at the shoulder, hat pulled low, coat dusted white. When he stepped into the thin light, she breathed out. Sawyer did not speak at first. Snow clung to the brim of his hat, and his breath smoked in the air. In his hands he carried a folded wool blanket, thick and clean, and a small knife with a plain iron handle that caught the weak light. He came down into a crouch beside her, close enough to block the wind, far enough to leave her space. He set the blanket on her lap, the weight of it a shock of warmth, then placed the knife near her boot, careful and steady. "You might sleep better," he said, "if you had a way to keep yourself safe." His voice was quiet, as if he were talking to a skittish colt. Her throat worked. "Why?" she asked, the word little and hoarse. "Why help me?" "You are not livestock," he said. "Simple as that. You do not deserve to freeze like one." The splinter she held dropped. A sound broke from her, small and raw, not fear, not even sorrow, but the sharp ache of somebody seeing her as more than rumor and trouble. Tears came hot, and she turned her face into the scarf. Ashamed of the wet on her cheeks, ashamed of how good the wool felt under her fingers, Sawyer did not reach for her, did not speak another word. He knocked the snow from his gloves, stood, and tipped his hat. "I will come back in the morning," he said. "Stay near the stables." She nodded, could not trust her voice. He went the way he had come, steps fading, the alley empty but for the soft hiss of falling snow. Margot pulled the blanket around her, tucked the knife under her palm, and leaned her head against the timber. The wind sang its thin song through the fence. The saloon doors banged once, then went quiet. And in that silence, she let herself cry until the tight knot in her chest eased. When sleep came, it came like a slow tide, and for the first time in a long while it was not cruel. The morning rose pale and still. A soft light, like skim milk, poured over the roofs of Dry Creek, the frost shining on every nailhead and rail. Breath hung in the air in slow clouds, and the only sounds were a rooster far off and the soft stamp of a horse in the street. Margot woke with the scarf warm against her throat and the blanket folded over her knees, the knife tucked under her palm, where her fingers had curled around it in sleep. For a moment she did not move, only listened, half afraid the night kindness had been a dream. Then she heard the jingle of tack and the steady tread of boots. Sawyer stood by the feed room, 2 horses saddled and waiting, his hat low, his face calm as river stone. The bay mare tossed her head, the dun flicked an ear, and both sent up little plumes of white with each breath. He looked at Margot, not at the dirt on her hem or the red on her hands, but at her eyes, and gave a small nod, like this was an ordinary morning, and they had ordinary business to see to. "You ready to get out of this place?" he asked, voice easy. "My place is quiet, plenty of room, hens for eggs, a roof that does not leak if you mind the stove." Margot sat up, smoothed the blanket, and looked down the alley to the street, where a pair of men stood talking with their backs turned, where a woman hurried by with a basket and did not glance their way. "Where would I go?" she asked, and heard how thin the words were, how they carried hope and fear in the same breath. He lifted a shoulder. "You can ride with me, learn the trails, work if you please, or rest if you need. I stopped caring about talk years ago. I will not ask you a thing you do not offer." Her fingers found the knife, and she slid it into her pocket, then stood, the blanket across her arm, the scarf snug. "You are not worried what people will say?" she asked. one last time. I am not, he said. And that was the end of it. He helped her up onto the mare, his hands firm on her boot and her elbow. Careful, respectful. The saddle creaked, leather soft with use. He gave her the reins, then swung onto the dun, with the easy grace of a man who belonged there. They walked the horses to the edge of the street, past the smell of yeast and wood smoke, past the clatter of a shutter lifting, past the general store, where a boy swept snow from the step. No one called out. No one stopped them. The sun was just prying up the edge of the sky when they left town behind and took the wagon track that wound toward the hills. Frost clung to the grass like sugar, and the creek ran dark and narrow between banks of white. They did not speak for a while. The silence between them did not bite. It felt like a quilt, patched from their two kinds of quiet, his made of years, hers made of need. At a rise he slowed the horses. If you ride with your shoulders loose, he said, the mare will breathe easier. She copied him, and the mare lowered her head, the stride smoothing. He watched, then nodded. Good. They went on like that, small lessons tucked into the morning. And as the town shrank to a smudge and the land opened wide, Margot let herself think the word home, not out loud, but soft in her chest, where it could warm her from the inside out. The cabin sat low against the hill, snug as a badger in its den, with a split rail fence and a small lean to where wood was stacked under a sheet of tin. The creek ran a few steps beyond, thin ice shivering along the edges, water dark and quick beneath. Sawyer showed Margot how the place worked without many words. He pointed to the woodpile, to the henhouse, to the stove with its iron belly and stubborn door. And then he let her walk and look and breathe it in. The quiet here was not empty. It held the soft cluck of hens, the tick of cooling iron, the slide of wind through sage. It felt like a room that had waited with lamps trimmed, patient and steady. He set the first lesson with kindling. Dry pine curls, he said, and split pieces no thicker than your thumb. He showed her how to stack them so air could move, how to touch a match to the thinnest edge, how to listen for the low hungry hum that meant the flame would hold. She tried, hands clumsy at first, smoke smarting her eyes, and then she found the small, sweet pattern and the fire woke right, not choking, not sulking. He did not praise, only tipped his head and moved on, and that was better than praise. At the creek he taught her the stone that held fast, the one slick with moss, the way to brace with the far foot when lifting a full bucket, so the weight did not pull her into the cold. She learned to wring clothes without turning her wrists raw, learned the trick of snapping a sheet so it would not freeze in its own folds, learned that if she sang low while she worked, the day slid by kinder. He never told her to sing, but he heard it, and sometimes his mouth eased, almost a smile. He put a book on the table, a thin one with poems, and a tin of molasses beside flour and cornmeal. He said cornbread, and stepped back. She stirred and guessed and burned the first pan, black edges, hard center. He did not laugh. He cut a small square, chewed, and set a glass of milk by her hand. Try again, he said. She did, with less heat and more patience, and the second pan came out brown as late wheat, soft in the middle, a small wind that made her chest lift. When the day stretched long, he offered the reins and a circle around the meadow. Loose hands, he said. Easy seat. Look where you want to go. Her back ached from tension. Her thighs trembled, but the mare settled under her when she remembered to breathe. He brought a rifle from the pegs, checked the chamber, and put it into her grip. Just in case, he said. You are not trying to kill, you are trying to live. He stood behind her, not close, steady as a post, and guided the sight to a knot in a fence post. The crack startled her, but the knot chipped, and she laughed, shocked at her own surety. They ate simple, beans with onion, cornbread with a scrape of molasses, coffee thin but hot. Nights, the stove ticked and the wind spoke against the eaves, and the silence lay soft between them. She mended his shirt where the elbow had worn thin, and he set a second hook by the door for her coat. It was nothing, and it was everything. By the end of the week, the place had the shape of two lives, moving careful around each other, learning where to step, where to stop, and how to keep a good flame. The cold crept in slow that evening, the kind that hides in corners and waits, the kind that makes the stove work hard, and the breath hang in little ghosts. Margot felt it first as a shiver that would not stop, a fine tremble in her hands, a tight ache behind her eyes. She told herself she was tired, that the water at the creek had been colder than usual, that she would warm by the stove. She folded the last shirt, set it on the chair, and reached for the kettle. But the room swayed and the cup slipped from her fingers. It did not break, it only rolled, and she stood still and watched it as if it were far away. Sawyer looked up from the table, his chair scraping back slow. Not loud, not sharp. "You should sit," he said, and his voice was calm, steady, a rope thrown sure. She shook her head, then nodded, then let him guide her to the bed. Her skin felt too tight, her bones too light, and the chill ran through her like a creek in spring flood. He touched the back of his hand to her brow and did not curse, but his jaw went hard. He stoked the fire, not fierce, just firm, fed it small pieces so the room would not smoke. He set a pot of water to warm, brought a basin, tore a clean strip from an old shirt, and made a cool cloth for her forehead. "Drink," he said, lifting her head so the cup met her mouth, his hand under her neck, careful of her hair, patient with the slow swallow. The water seemed to fall through her, and sweat beaded along her hairline and ran down into the curve of her ear. Time lost its shape. The light on the floor shifted, then went, and the room was only the lamp, the red eye of the stove, and his shadow on the wall. When her breath went fast, he read, not fancy words, just a thin book of poems, plain lines about fields and wind, and a bird that kept singing in the rain. His voice was rough, the sound of gravel and kindness together, and the rhythm of it held her on the cliff edge of sleep. When her hands shook, he held them until they stilled. When she tossed, he laid a palm flat against her shoulder, weight steady, like a stone on a paper in a gust. She drifted into dreams that were not kind, a door closing, a crowd turning their backs, the cold mouth of a long road. Each time the fear rose, the cloth found her brow, the cup found her lips, the voice found her, and she clung to those small harbors. She did not know what hour it was when she woke enough to see his face clear, lines deeper with worry, eyes rimmed red. The lamp burned low, the wick a small brave flame, and the room smelled of soap, wood smoke, and the faint iron of fever. "You are not alone," he said, and it was not a promise, it was a fact, set down like a plate on a table. At last, the heat loosened its grip, her skin cooled, her breath slowed, and the ache eased. Dawn came thin, like milk poured through muslin, and slid under the shutter. She stared at the window, then at their hands. His fingers were still laced with hers, not from duty, but because at some point in the long dark he had reached for her and had not let go. She squeezed, light as a sparrow, and felt him squeeze back, and a small peace settled where the fear had lived. The stove ticked, the creek whispered, and the day began. The day after the fever broke was clear and sharp, the sky bright as a tin plate, the ground crisp under hoof. Sawyer saddled the dun and the bay, packed a small sack with bread and a wedge of cheese, and tied the sack behind his saddle. Margot wrapped the scarf close, slid the knife into her pocket out of habit, and met him by the fence. He watched her face for color, waited to see if the light would hurt her, then nodded when he saw strength, not sickness, in her eyes. They rode out slow, side by side, toward the open country, where the grass lay flat under old snow and the wind drew clean lines along the ridge. They climbed a narrow trail to a high place where the world spread wide, blue hills stacked against the sky, creek silver below, sage and rock and pine stitched together. The cold tasted bright, and the sun warmed the tops of their shoulders. For a while they said nothing. It was the easy kind of quiet, the kind that lets a heart settle. A hawk turned lazy circles overhead. A faint herd of antelope dotted the low flats to the west. The land felt honest, and that made the words come easier. "I was not always running," Margot said at last. "Eyes on the far hills. My family had a house once, white posts, long steps, a piano in the front room. We lived in Georgia. The war came, and then it left us with ash where the fields had been, and a father who had pride and ghosts. He could not feed both, not for long. Sawyer kept his horse at a walk, hands light on the reins. He did not turn his head, but she could feel he was listening all the way through. He did not rush her, did not reach for a neat end to the tale. A man came, she said, a railroad heir, fine clothes, fine words, Lucas Avaril. He wanted a wife, and my father wanted a ladder out of ruin. They shook on it. I was the thing being traded. At first, I thought I could live inside that choice. Many women have. Then I saw him as he was. He hurt the weak. He liked it when a person could not say no. She swallowed, the cold air sharp in her throat. He laid hands on a girl who worked in the kitchen. She came to me with bruises. I told my father. He told me to be grateful. I told Lucas I would not marry him. He laughed and said if I did not, he would call me a thief. He would say the brooch I wore, my mother's, was his. He would say the shawl I packed was his gift. He would say the locket I have had since I was a child belonged to him too. She touched the locket at her throat, small and warm from her skin. I took what was mine and I ran. He made posters and sent writers. They call it theft. I call it a life. They reached the top of the ridge. Sawyer dismounted, looped his reins over a scrub of juniper, and handed her the canteen. She drank, water cold and clean, felt it settle like a stone in her middle. He stood with his hands on his hips, looking out over the spread of land, quiet, for a long breath. If that is a crime, he said, voice low and steady, then every woman with a backbone should be locked up. He looked at her then. Not pity, not doubt, only something firm as bedrock. I am not turning back. Not unless you ask me to. Margot let out air she did not know she had been holding. I do not want to go back, she said. I want to go forward. Then forward it is, he said. They stood there while the hawk drifted, while the wind wrote soft across the grass. And in that high, thin light, the past did not vanish, but it loosened its teeth. They mounted and rode on, and the trail that dropped from the ridge felt like a road they had chosen together, a line cut through fear and into the clean open of what might yet be. Snow sat thick on the roof when the knock came, a hard rap that cut through the quiet and made the lamp flame lean. Afternoon light had gone thin, the kind that does not warm the boards or the bones. Margot was at the table peeling potatoes, slow and steady, the peels curling like brown ribbons into a bowl. Sawyer set down his whetstone, wiped the blade of his knife on a rag, and stood. He gave her a look that said, "Stay put," then crossed to the door and lifted the latch. A rider waited on the porch, coat long and dark, hat rimed with frost, rifle snug in a scabbard. His horse blue white, hooves planted, ears forward. The man's face was lean, his eyes the kind that measured a room in one sweep and missed nothing. "You Sawyer Reed?" he asked. The words flat, not friendly, not rude. Sawyer nodded once. "Who is asking?" The rider reached into his coat, slow so no one would jump, and brought out a folded paper. "Name is Caleb Hart," he said. "I ride bounty for hire, and I am here on legal business." Sawyer held the paper up, the ink black and neat even in the low light. "Wanted," it said, "for theft of dowry goods and absconding from engagement," and there was Margot's name, and a reward that made a man think foolish thoughts. The stamp at the bottom was a seal from Georgia, and the lines above it were signed by a man with money to throw and a grudge to feed. Sawyer folded the paper careful, the edges aligned, then handed it back. "She is not here," he said. Caleb's mouth tipped, not a smile, more a thought. "You sure about that?" he asked. "I am," Sawyer said. "She came through half dead some weeks back, ate, slept by the stove, and went on." "You let a wanted woman walk?" "I let a person walk," Sawyer said. "If she was what that says, I did not see it." "Mind if I take a look around?" Caleb asked, voice mild, eyes not. "I do," Sawyer said, and he did not move from the doorway. The cold pressed at his back, the warmth of the room at his shoulders, and the space between his boots and the threshold felt like a line he had drawn into the wood. A long moment stretched thin. The horse shifted, and the porch boards creaked. From her place by the table, Margot could see his profile, the set of his jaw, the calm he wore like another layer of cloth. Caleb clicked his tongue once, the sound small in the white air. "You know how this works," he said. "If I find you harboring her, the blame will share your roof." Sawyer did not blink. "I understand," he said. "More than you think." Caleb tucked the paper away, gathered his reins, and turned the horse. Snow squeaked under iron, and the rider slipped back down the track. Careful, quiet, not in a hurry. Sawyer watched from the porch until the dark coat was a stitch in the trees. When he turned back, the room felt different. He shut the door, set the latch, and found the table empty, the bowl of peels left like a small abandoned nest. He went out the back and saw the hatch marks of small boots in the snow, headed toward the canyon path, quick and straight. He saddled the dun with hands that did not shake, looped the halter rope, and swung up. The sun had dropped behind the ridge, the light gone to iron, and the cold bit hard at his cheeks. But he pressed on. He followed the line of her steps, where the wind had not yet erased them, past sage bent under frost, past a willow that whispered, into the cut of the canyon where shadows pooled. He found her at a rock overhang, jacket tight around her, face pale and set, and he swung down, breath smoking, ready to speak the words that would bring her back inside the circle of his care. Words spread the way wind spreads smoke, thin at first, then thick enough to sting. Dry Creek talked, as towns do, on porches, in the store, in the warm breath between a cup and a lip. "They say she is a thief," someone said by the barrels of beans. "They say she ran from a rich man," another added, like that was a crime. Some men spat dark juice and looked pleased to spit. Some women crossed the street when Margot passed, chin high, eyes fixed on something far away, as if that made the hurt smaller. She kept to the edge of the boardwalk, to the shadow of eaves, to the parts of town where the wind did the talking. Yet not all mouths were cruel. Mrs. Delaney at the apothecary had hands that trembled from old pain, but her voice did not. She stood at the post office and faced the sheriff, her shawl tight and her eyes wet. "My Clara was near gone once. Fever burned her lungs," she said, "and the doctor was off birthing a calf. That girl, the one you call a thief, sat by my child, brewed willow and thyme, cooled her skin, and read the Psalms till morning. Clara lived. Ask anyone." Sheriff Dobson rubbed at his jaw, looked at his boots, and said he would ask. The Reverend heard the talk too. He had worn gray once, had watched too many boys go into ground, had carried a Bible through smoke and noise. Now he kept the chapel lamp trimmed and the doors open to cold feet on wood. He sat at his desk by lantern light, pen scratching slow. To the Honorable Judge on the circuit, he wrote, "I cannot tell you all of Miss Lair's past, but I can tell you what I have seen with my own eyes. She is not a danger to this place. She is, in quiet, a mender of what men break." He folded the letter, sealed it neat, and carried it to the post himself, his coat thin, his steps steady. At the homestead the days held small work, feeding hens, mending a fence, tending the stove so it burned clean. Margot moved with care, and when a knock came now, her shoulders climbed, then settled when it was only a neighbor boy with eggs to trade, or Mrs. Delaney with a jar of salve, left on the step and a quick retreat. Sometimes Margot stood at the window and watched the wind-heard snow across the yard. "I can go," she told Sawyer one night, the words low and flat, "if it makes the load lighter for you." He set his cup down, hands around it to keep in the heat. "It is not too much," he said. "The talk will pass. What matters stays." But their names did not stop at fences. A copy of the poster hung in the store, another at the saloon, a third on the chapel board. Women paused, men stared, boys pointed and got their ears boxed for it. The town bent, one way, then another, as a branch bends in wind, and in that bending, witnesses rose. The blacksmith spoke of a time Margot had carried water to his wife when the baby would not come. The schoolmarm said she had seen Margot give her scarf to a child with no hat. Little things, but a town is built of little things. The sheriff listened, slow as he was, careful as a man testing ice. "We will see," he said. But his hat tipped lower in thought, and the Reverend's letter rode the mail north. A small hope with a long road. Market day filled the square with wagons and voices, the kind of busy that makes a town feel larger than it is, with barrels rolled to the shade, sacks stacked neat, and children weaving between skirts and boot heels. The sky was bright, but the air still had teeth, and posters on rough boards lifted and fell with each little gust. "Wanted," they said, with neat ink and a seal. A name, too, and the numbers that turn heads. Folks read, then looked over their shoulders as if the paper might point a finger. Some snorted, some nodded, and some looked tired of the whole thing. Sawyer rode in slow, not to make a show, but not to hide either. He swung down, tied the dun to a post, and walked to the center of the square where the dirt was packed hard from wagon wheels and boots. He had the paper in his hand, the same as the ones on the walls, and he lifted it so the sun touched it. People got quiet, in the way a crowd does when a man stands where all can see. He looked around, found the sheriff by the water trough, the mayor near the store door, Mrs. Delaney with her shawl pinned tight, and the Reverend under the chapel eave. "This is what you have seen," he said, the words even. "But it is not what I have seen. I have seen a woman fight to live when many would have laid down. I have seen her make fire when the wood was mean, make bread when the flour was low, sit with a colt through a long cold night, and sit with a sick man too proud to call it fever. I have seen truth, not theft. I have seen courage, not shame." A murmur went through the people, a ripple over grass. The blacksmith crossed his arms and nodded once. Mrs. Delaney stepped forward, chin up, hands shaking but not her voice. "He tells it right," she said. "That girl saved my child with nothing but herbs and a prayer when the doctor was away. The sheriff knows it, the Lord knows it, and so do I." The Reverend raised a hand, not to hush, but to be heard. "I have sent a letter to the judge," he said, careful and clear. "I gave my word on her character, and I do not lay my name where it does not fit." A man near the saloon spat and said, "Law is law," but his voice did not carry far. A woman by the dry goods said, "Hearts can be fooled," but her eyes slid away when Sawyer met them. The sheriff took off his hat and turned it in his hands. He looked at the poster on the wall, then at the one in Sawyer's grip, then at the faces in front of him, faces he knew from births and funerals, from fights and harvests. He put his hat back on and spoke slow. "A town stands for what it will stand for," he said. "We are not the court in Georgia. We are not the man who signed that paper. We are Dry Creek. If a judge comes asking, he will hear that we are not hiding a criminal. We are keeping faith with one of our own." No one cheered. The sound that came was softer, feet shifting, breath let out. Sawyer lowered the paper and folded it once. Neat. He did not smile. He only said thank you, and it was to all of them and to none. At the edge of the square, behind the blacksmith's wall, Margot stood with her hand on the rough board, listening. Her chest hurt like a tight boot loosening, and her eyes burned, but she did not move. The wind lifted the corner of a poster and tore it free, sent it tumbling like a dry leaf down the street, and no one chased it. Spring came soft to the high country, green pushing up through old snow, creek full and quick, sky bright as washwater. The air held the smell of wet earth and new grass, and the hill behind the cabin wore a fresh lace of wild bloom. Sawyer set out a few chairs in a crescent on the short grass, plain chairs from the table and porch, their legs leaving small marks in the damp ground. He stacked flat stones near a hawthorn tree that stood like a white cloud, its blossoms open and sweet. He did not hang ribbons or lay a cloth. The land was enough. Mrs. Delaney came with her daughter, both in clean shawls, simple and neat. The blacksmith stood with his hands behind his back, hat held low, a man who knew the weight of iron and the ease of joy. The stable boy hovered at the edge, hair slicked, boots wiped, face bright as a penny. The Reverend walked up the path quiet, Bible under his arm, coat buttoned, eyes soft, with a kind of pride that does not need to be seen. They took their seats without fuss. A wind went by that smelled of applewood and new leaves, and the hawthorn whispered like a friend leaning close. Margot stepped from the cabin, dressed clean and plain, a collar of lace that had been her mother's, the hem mended by her own hand. Her dark hair was braided low, and behind her ear was a small wild daisy that Sawyer had picked by the fence. She held no flowers. She held nothing at all. Her hands were steady, her eyes clear. She walked over the grass to where Sawyer waited by the stones, his shirt white, his coat brushed, a patch still neat at one elbow, boots clean but scarred. He looked at her as a thirsty man looks at water, not greedy, only full. The Reverend opened his Bible, then closed it again, and kept a finger in the place. "We gather to mark what has already begun," he said. "Not to erase any past, but to set a light on a choice." He looked from one to the other. "You speak from freedom. You speak from truth. Do you come of your own will?" They both said, "I do," and their voices were sure. "Speak your vows," he said. Sawyer reached in his coat, took out a paper, then folded it once more and put it back. He took her hands. "I have little to give," he said. "No gold, no name that opens doors, no grand land. What I have, I give. My days, my work, my storms, my quiet, my hands, my hearth, my word. I will stand when wind rises. I will bend when you bend. I will learn the long way of joy with you." Margot's lips trembled, but she did not look down. "I thought life would be only a kind of fight," she said, "a road of harsh bread and cold beds. You gave me stillness, and a place to set my name down without fear. I will keep your fire lit. I will keep your name safe. I will meet your storms with steady feet, and love you in the small ways that last." The Reverend lifted his voice a little. "By grace, and by the will of those who stand here, I call you man and wife." No one clapped. Sawyer bowed his head to hers, and their foreheads touched like a seal set warm. The hawthorn shed a few white petals, and they fell on their shoulders like a blessing, light and sure. "Mrs. Delaney smiled and wiped her eye. The blacksmith cleared his throat. The boy grinned and kicked at a clump of grass. The creek kept on talking, the sky kept on blue, and two people stood where they had chosen to stand, under a tree that blooms after winter, and called it home. Spring settled into the valley like a cat finding a sunny spot, slow and pleased, with warm days and soft nights, with grass up to the ankles and the creek laughing over smooth stones. The cabin had weathered to a gentle gray, the porch boards creaked in a friendly way, and the shutters held fast when the wind came calling. In the little garden, peas reached for twine, onions fattened under dark soil, and a row of daisies nodded like they knew some sweet secret. The sign over the door had gone soft to the touch, but the words were still clear. Where bread was offered, a family was born, and anyone who came up the path could feel how true that was. Margot moved easy through the rooms, bare feet quiet on the plank floor, a bowl of dough under one arm, and the other hand dusted with flour. The kitchen smelled of yeast and warm iron, and she worked the dough with the steady push that sent all worry into the wood. On the windowsill, a loaf cooled on a folded cloth, the crust brown as late wheat, the steam slipping up like a morning prayer. She tapped the loaf with a knuckle and smiled at the little hollow sound, then wiped her hands and set about the rest of the day. Sawyer came from the barn with dust on his shirt and sun on his neck, a grin tucked under his mustache because of something the colt had figured out at last. Over his shoulder, their boy slept, a sturdy 3-year-old with hay in his hair, lips open, hands still fisted around a bit of string that had been a halter for a stick horse. Sawyer eased the child onto a quilt beneath the apricot tree, where pale petals drifted down like soft snow, and shook his head when one landed on the boy's nose and did not wake him. The tree was sweet with fruit for later, and already the bees thought this place was home. At the fence, a neighbor girl chased a clutch of chicks, her laughter ringing like a tin bell, and the hens scolded as if dignity was a thing they remembered. Margot stepped outside and leaned on the post, the sun warm through her dress, her hair undone and catching light. She rested a hand on her belly where new life turned slow. A little hello from inside. I used to think home was for other people, she said. Not to be sad, just to honor the long road. Sawyer set his palm over hers, the two hands a sure cover over hope. You made it ours, he said. And the words felt like a roof, like a door, like a soft bed that waits. They ate simple, at a small table. A wedge of bread, a bit of cheese, a handful of early greens. The boy waking full of questions that tripped over each other. How does a creek know which way to run, he asked. And why do apricots smell like sunshine? And who taught the rooster to brag? They answered as best they could, laughing into their plates, content to be wrong if they were together. Later, when the light went gold, Sawyer brought out a cradle he had carved over many evenings, daisies on the sides, hearts at the corners, smooth as a wish. Margot ran her fingers along the edge and felt the care tucked into every curve. They carried it inside and set it by the bed, and the house seemed to sigh, ready for small breaths and tiny socks on a line. Outside, the wind ran along the ridge and through the hawthorn. And if a person listened close, they could hear names in it, not shouted, not carved into stone, only spoken soft and true, the kind you choose and keep. Thank you for riding with us through this quiet story of bread, shelter, and the kind of love that grows when no one is looking. If it warmed your heart, subscribe to Western Love Legends, tap like, and tell us your favorite moment in the comments. We save a seat by the stove for every new friend. And if you stop by the windowsill, mind the loaf. Sawyer swears it cools faster when folks pretend not to smell it.